Good morning, and thank you, Ben. It is indeed my pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker, former Senator Saxby Chambliss. Senator Chambliss has served in the U.S. Senate for 2 terms and in the U.S. House of Representatives for 4 terms. He was first elected to Congress to represent Georgia's 8th District in 1994. During his tenure in the Senate, he served as a member of the Armed Services Committee, the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, the Rules Committee, and his leadership and experience on Homeland Security and intelligence matters earned him an appointment to the Senate Committee on Intelligence, where he served as vice chair from 2011 to 2014. Throughout his legislative career, he has been recognized numerous times by the public and private sectors for his work on agriculture, defense, budget, and national security issues. He was also listed on Georgia Trend magazine's Most Influential Georgians many times. Senator Chambliss earned his BA from Terry in 1966, obtained a JD from the University of Tennessee. After he graduated in 1968, he moved to Moultrie, Georgia, where he practiced agricultural law. He and his wife, Julianne, have 2 children and 6 grandchildren. Senator Chambliss is an avid hunter and fisherman and a friend to us all. He wears many hats, from fraternity brother to our senator and this morning's speaker. So please, if you would, join me in welcoming this morning's speaker, Saxby Chambliss.
Well, thank you very much, Zach, and it's a pleasure to me to have a chance to visit with you this morning. I've had a chance to see some of my former classmates at UGA, none of whom got up for an 8 o'clock class. And to see them getting here at this time of day is pretty impressive. Zach, thanks for that generous introduction. Zach is one of my former staffers, and I, like so many folks who have, in my case, limited success, but you don't have success without surrounding yourself with good people. And I thought about that comment, and then I thought, well, a lot of these people know Zach, and I don't know whether I ought to say that. But I have been blessed with so many UGA graduates, a lot of whom are Terry School graduates, over the years in my office. And they're the kind of folks who generate enthusiasm and inspire members of the House, members of the Senate, whichever. And Zach certainly fell into that category. As Zach says, I've spent 20 years in Washington, the last 12 in the United States Senate. It was a great run of 20 years. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Never thought in my wildest moments that in 1994, when I got elected to the House of Representatives, I'd be there for 20 years. But as it turned out, I was there during some of the most historic times in the history of our country. The impeachment of a president, which has only happened twice, kicking a member of the House of Representatives out, which has only happened twice in the history of our country. Balancing the budget, which is something I wish the current crowd would get a little more focused on. But having a chance to serve with the men and women that I've been privileged to serve with is the highest honor I could ever have. And it truly was a great run. People ask me all the time now, well, do you miss it? And I do miss the day-to-day contact with my friends, because that's what politics is all about, making friends both within the circle and outside the circle. And I miss the being in the back room when the deals are done. And I was blessed over the last decade when any major deal was done, whether it was on the Hill or in the Situation Room of the White House. I was fortunate enough to be there and had a chance to be involved in setting some policy that will last forever and ever. That part I miss. The day-to-day routine, what they're going through right now, I don't miss one bit. Now, I still go to D.C. I spent 2 days in D.C. this week. I'm back and forth there and around the country regularly, but it's on my schedule. I don't have to go to D.C. when Harry Reid tells me I have to be there. So from that standpoint, it has been a real pleasure not to be there. And plus, I always wanted a life after the Senate, and I'm very blessed now to be at DLA Piper and Judy and seemed like I saw somebody else across the room, Judy, from DLA is here. These guys are letting me do what I want to do, which is take advantage of my contacts around the country and around the world. I'm focused on the issue of cybersecurity, which I've been involved in for the last 5 years from a legislative standpoint. And so Julianne and I are having lots of fun right now. As I think about my days in Washington and how UGA helped me get there, it's pretty easy. And there are lots of practical things that happened over my course of being involved in politics that related directly to what I've always considered the 4 best years of my life, which were the 4 in Athens. I obviously was fortunate enough to get a great degree, but frankly, Dean, more importantly, I met my wife in Athens. And that's been the biggest asset of my lifetime. But when Julianne is, and the other thing was that I entered the University of Georgia 53 years ago, Manning, this September. It's hard to believe. But there was a guy that entered at the exact same time I did named Johnny Isaacson. And Johnny and I became fast friends. We double dated together because we're both hanging around the Phi Mu house. He was over at the SAE house, I was at Sigma Chi house, and we've been good friends ever since. And to have the privilege of serving with him is one of those other honors that I was blessed with. And as Julianne will say, when the two of us are on a program together and she's introducing one of us, she always said that, you know, when we were at the University of Georgia, Johnny Isaacson was a big man on campus. Everybody knew one of these days he was going to be governor in the Senate or whatever. Saxby was the surprise. He was president of this, president of that. My role, as Alan Stith and some of these Sigma Chi's over here will remember, was to make sure that the keg was iced down and delivered on Wednesday nights. That was my leadership role, and I succeeded. I was a great leader when it came to that. The foundation that I got at the University of Georgia was obviously of significant import from the standpoint of, you know, what you're made of type thing. To see the opening of the Pete Carell building at the Terry College is very significant. Alan Stith and John, who are contemporaries of mine, remember Pete Carell very well. And none of us ever envisioned in 1964-65 that Pete Carell would have a building named after him. We envisioned that Pete's picture might be on the post office wall somewhere. But to see folks like that succeed and to have the opportunity to interact with friends like Pete that I made during my years at the University of Georgia are memories that I truly cherish. The other anecdote I'll tell you about being a Bulldog is that 3 of my dearest friends, in fact, we were 4 best friends in Congress for all of my 20 years, was current Speaker John Boehner, Tom Latham, who's a congressman from Iowa that just retired, and then Richard Burr, who is current senator from North Carolina. Burr and Latham and I were all elected together to the House in 1994. We became fast friends and friends with Boehner pretty quick, and we spend a lot of time together. One of the things that we do together is every year we go to the White House Christmas party together. And for the last, I guess it's been about 15 years now, Boehner's been in a position that he can make sure that instead of having your picture individually, we annoy the White House press corps because we want our picture together, all 8 of us with the President and the First Lady. So in 2009, President Obama it's his first White House Christmas party, and we drive up in Boehner's black sedans and get out on the the east wing side, and we come in the back door, and they usher us immediately into the room ahead of everybody else. Julianne walked right by Nancy Pelosi, and Julianne said, "Excuse me, I'm with the real speaker." And so we got to the front of the line, and we're standing there, first in line every year when the President and the First Lady walk out. Well, the President and First Lady comes in, here we are. She has on a gorgeous designer red and black dress. And Julianne can't control herself. She said, "Oh, Michelle, you look like a bulldog." She said, "Excuse me?" And everybody else is standing there just snickering because they know what she's talking about. She has no idea. And I don't know whether she's ever gotten over that or not. But anyway, she did look like a bulldog, so what can I say? During the course of my 20 years, things have to happen to you. And I was very blessed that a number of things happened to me that allowed me to be in a position of leadership, number one, and to impact things that have happened over the last 20 years, one of which was let me see, I'll have to make sure I get my dates right. End of the year 2000, I had just been reelected, and the then Speaker Denny Hastert came to me and said, "Sax, I'd like you to go on the Intelligence Committee." And I said, "Well, okay, I'm kind of burdened down with what I'm doing, ag-wise, armed services-wise." He said, "Well, I'd like for you to do it, and that's a speaker's appointment." And he said, "Just pick you an area of interest and on the Intel Committee, and just tell me what you want to do with it, and we'll do it." So I talked with my then Chief of Staff, Rob Lieburn, and Rob and I came up with the idea of creating a new subcommittee on the Intelligence Committee on terrorism and homeland security. And this was 2000, end of 2000. Boy, we had no idea, obviously, what was fixing to happen. But in any event, we created that new subcommittee, and the chairman, Porter Goss, named, but Nancy Pelosi, who was a member of the committee then, named Jane Harmon as my ranking member. And Jane is from California on social issues. She and I are this far apart, but on national security issues, there is not a light between the two of us. She was a great partner, and we really did some neat things. We decided that if we were going to take this position, that we were going to really do our homework and kind of enlighten our colleagues on some things, as well as trying to educate other members of the committee on an issue that, while it was bubbling then, it was still under the surface. But we traveled the world and literally had some fascinating times developing the issue of terrorism and homeland security with our colleagues. The most interesting trip I've ever taken in my life was when we started off in Egypt, and there were four of us on the trip. There was Jane, Richard Burr, and Pete Hoekstra. And when you do a trip like that, you usually get to meet with the head of state, at least briefly, and we had a meeting with Mubarak. And you have to remember then that Mubarak was the dean of all the leadership of the Middle East. The Middle East was still, it was calm compared to today, but the Middle East has always been a volatile part of the world. All you have to do is read the Bible and figure that out. But we walked into a meeting with Mubarak at the beginning of that trip, in which he came into the room, he went around and shook everybody's hand, came back to me, and he said, "Okay, Congressman, I'm here. Ask me anything you want to ask me." Well, here's a guy who had grown up in the Egyptian military. He knew the ins and outs, knew who had been involved in which coup, had been involved in a couple of different military coups, and he knew all the players in the region very well. he engaged in a conversation with us for 2 hours. It was truly a fascinating conversation. We then went to Syria, and Bashar Assad had been in office about 3 months, and he was obviously still not only new to the position, but he was a guy who had inherited his father's position as president of Syria, and he did not want to be where he was. He was an ophthalmologist, a practicing ophthalmologist in London, and was very happy working on people's eyes. And his older brother was supposed to be the next heir to the presidency in Syria, but he was killed in an automobile accident. So here Bashar is thrown into this position. We were the first group of Americans to have a chance to visit with him. And again, a very fascinating conversation. As we sat around the room, he speaks very plain English, but when we asked a question, he did not need an interpreter. But when he responded to the question, he spoke only through an interpreter. And the reason he did is because he was surrounded at that table by a number of his father's former ministers, particularly the Minister of Interior, which is usually their intelligence chief, and in this case was. And they didn't want him saying anything he shouldn't say. So we had a very engaging conversation with him, and left there and went to Israel and met with Sharon and all his cabinet members. Now, going to Israel was a pretty intriguing trip for this reason. Jane and I had talked about it before we left the States, that our last visit was going to be to Ramallah to meet with Yasser Arafat, who at that time was the #1 terrorist in the world. And we knew that we would really rile up the Jewish community if we went to meet with Arafat. But we decided that was an appropriate thing to do. The White House wanted us to do it, and we had a message to deliver to Arafat from President Bush. And so we by now, this was into 2001, obviously. We had been through a couple of different terrorist acts, including the bombing of the USS Cole and a couple of other situations that we knew there was some involvement of the Palestinian terrorist community. And so we laid down, first of all, some rules that if we decided we were going to go, we told Arafat, #1, you can have no cameras in the room. We're not going to be a pawn, political pawn for Arafat to show film of slapping the back of a bunch of Americans and American congressmen and smiling and whatnot, which they didn't like, but they finally agreed to that. And then we were going to limit the subjects that we were going to talk about. Well, that didn't last, but anyway, we had these ground rules. So we we get to Israel, and we met with our AIPAC friends first of all, because we had to get their blessing. The decision wasn't made until after that meeting to actually go to Ramallah. But they finally signed off and said, look, you know, somebody needs to engage this particular segment of the Palestinians in conversation, and maybe y'all can do some good while you're there, basically. So Sharon knew that we were meeting with Arafat the night that we went in and met with he and his cabinet. We did not get a very good reception. He was upset we were going. He said, you're just going to give credibility to Arafat, and I don't think you ought to go. Well, we had an engaging conversation with him about that in the presence of his ministers, and thank goodness Jane is Jewish, and she could say some things that I couldn't say. But at the end of the day, the decision was made, and we were going. The thing I should have said about Mubarak was we talked to Mubarak about going to see Arafat. He said, by all means, you should go. You should meet with him. But the last thing he told me before we left his office that day is that when you meet with Arafat, you'll have, I'm sure, a good conversation with him, but I promise you, Congressman, at the end of the day, he will lie to you. Well, so we go to to Ramallah the next day, and as we are heading up there, it is a very challenging trip. We went through about 6 different checkpoints, and those are real checkpoints where they check you very closely, both the Israelis as well as the Palestinians. And Pete Hoekstra from Michigan, who as I say, was with us, was what we call a white knuckle rider going up to the hills of Ramallah that day. That is, he was holding on to this bar on front of his seat, and his knuckles turned white. He was squeezing it so hard. But what we knew on any trip like that, they're not foolish enough to engage any member of Congress and put you in any kind of danger. So the thing that really made me feel good about that trip was, as we turned one corner and headed up the hill, and everything up there was blown out. I mean, it had been bombed and rockets blowing up every house and every standing building, had some significant damage to it. But as we rounded one of the corners, I looked up, and here's this red and white truck with Coca-Cola written on the side of it. And for some reason, I just had a feeling of calm coming over me, knowing that Atlanta was already represented there. So we had this meeting with Arafat, and we thought, again, just like Mubarak, it was going to last 10 or 15 minutes. And it wound up lasting an hour and a half. Arafat started in on us and I mean, was just blasting away at America and at our president and whatever, and he wouldn't stop to give me a chance to say anything. And finally, he took a breath, and when he did, I just interjected. I said, Mr. President, let me tell you something. I didn't come here to lecture you, but I certainly did not come here to be lectured by you on what your thoughts are relative to America and President Bush. I came here to deliver a message to you from President Bush, and here it is. And I laid out the things that the president wanted me to say. And one of the things that we knew was that we had just intercepted a ship that was flying an Egyptian flag that was headed to deliver arms to the PLO. And I had seen the manifest of that ship, and I started ticking off facts that he knew were true relative to that ship. And I think it kind of took him by surprise that we really came there kind of knowing what we were talking about. And it wound up being a very engaging hour and a half conversation. I'm not sure a lot was accomplished by it. I did get a nice, if you can believe this, coming from a Palestinian, a nice Christmas scene made of some expensive ivory or something that Julian refuses to put out because it's got his name on it. But at the end of the conversation, we started talking about grandchildren, and he became a very warm person at that point in time. You could tell that he did love his family, at least, even though he didn't love Americans, obviously. And we had kept the cameras out, except at the end of the meeting, I noticed a little discussion going on at the doorway, which we were getting ready to go out. And I had these 2 guys that worked for me, 2 staffers that worked for me. Both of them were former CIA agents. One of them was about 6'6", weighed about 280. The other one was about 6'6" and weighed about 180. But anyway, they were standing at the doorway, and what had happened was that there were TV cameras right outside the door, and they all of a sudden decided they wanted to come in. Well, these 2 guys made sure they didn't get in, and it was a little confrontation that we got over. But we had no film of the conversation, which obviously is exactly what we wanted. But we were walking down to the elevator, and Arafat and I are engaging in conversation again about our grandchildren. And so we get down to the elevator, and he reaches over and shakes my hand. And he says, I truly do want peace. I said, well, Mr. President, let me tell you this. If you're serious about that and you want our grandchildren to live in a peaceful world, particularly a peaceful Middle Eastern world, then I promise you my president is ready to work with you. I've already laid out what the message he wanted to deliver, and if you will work with us, I promise you, we will move towards a peaceful Middle East. And he said, I assure you that's what I want. Well, we got on the elevator and we left there, immediately went to Ben Gurion Airport and came back to D.C. 2 days later, I picked up the paper and I read where a group of Palestinians have gone into a bar mitzvah and have blown up 23 young Israelis. That's the moment I knew that what Mubarak had told me was true. Arafat looked me in the eye and he lied to me. The rest with respect to him is history, but it was truly a fascinating trip. The last 4 years that I was in the Senate were probably, without question, the most exciting, even though actually from a legislative standpoint, we did nothing. And that was one of the frustrations that led me to make my decision to leave the Senate, because I'm a solutions-oriented guy. I don't mind getting engaged in controversial issues like immigration or like what we did in the Gang of Six dealing with the budget, because those are issues that have got to be solved. Here we are, we dealt with the immigration issue 8 years ago, and where are we today? We have done nothing towards solving that huge problem that exists out there. On the issue of the budget, the Gang of Six did great work, and all we did was get criticism, except from people outside of Washington who realized what we were talking about made a lot of sense. And unfortunately, members of Congress didn't have the wherewithal to make the hard and tough decisions to reduce spending, reform entitlements, and generate revenues through changing the tax code, which is, most of you in here know, is so antiquated and needs changing. Well, what's going on up there right now? We're in the midst of what we call sequestration. That's a Washington speak term, but basically what it means is we're reducing spending every year. Spending in Washington today is somewhere around the levels comparatively to the 1950s, only because of sequestration, not because Congress has got some sort of will to reduce spending, but spending's coming down. And the conversation in Washington today relative to moving forward, the tax code reform is front and center. And it's got to happen, and it's going to happen. And if we don't do something with entitlements, Social Security and Medicare are going broke in the short term. So all of the things that we talked about and that we laid out a plan for, and it was not just the Gang of Six, it was Simpson Bowles, it was Domenici Rivlin. We all had the same idea. It's not rocket science as to what's got to happen to start working on this $18 trillion debt that we've got, and it's going up dramatically every single day. So the work that we did within the Gang of Six is turning out to be the foundation for what I know is going to happen long term, and that's the addressing of those three issues. We can't continue with sequestration. It's killing our military. What sequestration means basically is that because Congress doesn't have the will to reduce spending in different agencies of the government, every agency of the government has less money to spend every year. And it's by statute. So everybody comes down across the board, and it's across the board within each agency. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs doesn't have the option or the flexibility to reduce the size of the Army versus the Air Force, or the Department of Homeland Security doesn't have the option of reducing TSA or some other part of his agency. It's mandated, all of it across the board gets reduced. And that's just a terrible way to run a business, rather than giving that flexibility to individual agency heads. But that is happening. And while it was controversial, the work that we did has laid the right kind of foundation going forward, and is probably the best moment I ever had in Washington. I'll conclude with just one other comment about where we are today, because I could talk about what's going on in Iran or ISIS or whatever. But I'll leave that for your questions. The one area that I focused on for the last 5 years is the area of cybersecurity. When people ask me what keeps me up at night, there are 2 or 3 things that do, because over the last 4 years particularly, I don't get the same brief the president gets every morning, but over the course of a week I would get the highlights of everything that was told to the president in his daily brief from the intelligence community. And the issue of cybersecurity has been front and center now for the last several years, but it's been very quiet. There have been some very public situations that have changed that, whether it's Home Depot, whether it's Neiman Marcus, whether it's any number of other folks, banks that have been hit, stock market which has been hit, has all of a sudden changed the dynamics of cybersecurity. But there were 2 incidents that happened in 2014 that have changed even the direction of the issue of cybersecurity as we are seeing it in the intelligence and law enforcement community today. And those 2 situations were, previously we have had attacks which have sought to get either proprietary information, or the criminal world goes after money in the financial community and whatnot. But the biggest threat that we have is not the criminals, it's the state actors, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians particularly. Those are the 3 most sophisticated and the ones who intrude into our space or into our systems every single day, or at least make attempts to. But in 2014, the Iranian attack on the Sands Corporation Hotel in Las Vegas and the North Korean attack on Sony changed the dynamics, because they weren't after proprietary information. They weren't after money. They were out to destroy the infrastructure of those 2 entities. And that's an entirely new dynamic that has not been out there. I was engaged in any number of conversations, both within the White House and as well as on the Hill, about the issue of what constitutes an act of war in the world of cybersecurity. And no decision on that has been made yet. But it is critical that we make that decision. The attack against OPM, if that's not an act of war, I can't imagine what is. We know who did it. And yet we've sat there and we've continued to get our nose bloodied, and we just turn the other cheek and we do nothing. We not only have got to make a decision on what does constitute an act of war, but what's our policy when somebody does commit that. We're not going to fly B-2 bombers over and bomb Beijing or whatever, but we have got to start taking some offensive actions against these intruders and against these nation-state sponsors of cybersecurity. So those decisions are still in process, but as we go forward, it's something you might just, some of it will be in the press, not a lot of it will be in the press, but I assure you those decisions are taking place today as we speak and have got to be made in the short term. Otherwise, we as a nation are just going to continue to be so vulnerable when it comes to the theft of information, whether it's proprietary or classified or intellectual property or money or whatever, for years to come. I've been fortunate to be able to keep my finger in the intel world. I serve on 2 boards, 2 advisory boards. One is the CIA Directors Advisory Board, and we meet quarterly. I'll be back in D.C. next week, and we'll be discussing the current events and whatnot. And then I serve on the advisory board to the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, which is the central point now that all suspected acts of terrorism are funneled into, and it's the role of the National Counterterrorism Center to distribute information out regarding anything anybody thinks is an act of terrorism. it's one thing we created. It's about the only good thing I can think of we created with the Intelligence Modernization Act of several years ago. But it has allowed me to kind of stay tuned. But as a result of being on those boards, I had to get top secret clearance. And as a senator, you just have it. So I had been hearing all these things. Now, all of a sudden, to hear what I now hear, I had to go through and get my top secret clearance. Well, guess who did the background checks? OPM. So the Chinese have all of my personal information. Dean, I guess they've got my my transcript from the University of Georgia, which they could hold me hostage over that. But it has allowed me to continue to do something that I thoroughly enjoy as a result of the 20 years that I spent in Congress. Well, I'm going to stop because I'd like to be able to take some questions for a little while here. You said we got about 15 or 20 minutes, and I think there are microphones out there. So anybody that has a question or anything you want me to comment on, please just raise your hand and they'll give you a microphone.
Senator, thank you for your words today. Really, really interesting stories, and you kind of got to something that I was wondering about right, towards the end of your talk. With the OPM hack, in my view, it's exponentially a bigger deal, or an exponentially bigger deal than the Target hack, than the Home Depot hack, because that was taking credit card information. I mean, this is every employee, contractor, background, every piece of information. I guess you hit on some of the frustration that I feel, but what is being done about that particular hack and protecting our very, very trusted everybody associated with the government, and how maybe shed some light. I guess for me, I've read about it in the media and I've seen the director step down now and things like that. But it seems to be, it's amazing to me how little of a deal seems to have been made in the general public about this thing. And I'm sure there's good reason for that, but maybe speak a little bit more about that as well.
The OPM breach is significant in a couple of different ways. First of all, Chinese did it. I mean, we know that. And they have breached the database of one of our major agencies within the federal government. So what's next? They've tried the Pentagon. We get about 1 million hits at the Pentagon every day. And a lot of that is coming from nation-state actors, but we've got the sophisticated defensive mechanisms in place that have not allowed them to get information out of the Pentagon. But we did a poor job. In fact, I've written an article for a blog called Cipher One, which I'm on the board of, that'll be published Monday on this specific issue. And this has got to be a wake-up call for us from the standpoint of what we do, not only with defensive mechanisms, but offensive mechanisms. The conversation now needs to go public. It's been private in classified settings. It now needs to go public because the American people need to understand what we're doing and why we're not taking any action against these nation-state actors that come after us. And we pretty well know when something happens. We figure it out quickly enough to know whether it was some 15-year-old in his garage down the street who was trying to intrude into our space, or whether it was criminal activity or a nation state. And we've got the ability to take some action, and we've got to set that policy. What I would do is what I said in this blog. There are lots of good former leaders in the intelligence and law enforcement community out there who understand the corporate world, who are very capable of leading a real investigation into what's happening within every agency relative to the defensive mechanisms that we have in the cyber world. And what do we need to do going forward? I recommended 3 people: Bob Mueller, the former director of the FBI, Admiral McConnell, former director of national intelligence, and Leon Panetta, who is former CIA director and former Secretary of Defense. It's men like that or women like that that would be great at leading an investigation and giving them authority and resources to really do something and then have it followed through. If we don't do that, I'm just afraid that we're going to see every agency ultimately hacked and ultimately lots of private information, more so than the 21 million. And when you think about 21 million Americans' personal and sensitive information being breached, that's 1 in every 15 Americans. I mean, just think how many of you in this room that involves. So, I mean, this is real, and it's very personal. I've already seen some instances where they've come after my credit cards, and I don't know how they got it out of that, but I guess you have to give them all your financial information when you go through one of these background checks. So I guess that's the way they got it. I don't know, but this is real, and it's going to be felt by lots of Americans. And the worst part of it, not unlike the Snowden incident, which I hope none of you have any sympathy for him, because we need to hang him on the courthouse square as soon as we get our hands on him. But just like with Snowden, we're going to lose American lives as a result of this breach. And the reason we are is because the Chinese now have possession of all of our folks who have gone through background checks over the last 20 years. They know where the CIA agents are, even though there was some firewall on some CIA background checks. They do have information relative to where some of those folks are and who they are and what their cover is, and it's creating a very, very serious situation for us from that standpoint.
Senator, you were involved in discussions, I'm sure, about the Iranian arms deal, and now that that's been proposed, it's very politicized down party lines. Can you give us an objective analysis of what's good and what's bad about that?
Well, I was a little bit disappointed in a way to hear all of my Republican colleagues come out yesterday and start criticizing the deal. I haven't made any public statement. I'm not supportive of it. I can't imagine that I will be, but my rationale is a little bit different from some of the things I heard yesterday. But I want to look at the document. I want to see what it says. I know what the president has said, and it all sounds good. But then I'm hearing some details from some other folks that does not sound good. For example, if we don't have free and open access 24/7 to every installation that they've got that they've ever used, then this deal is meaningless. And when you say we're going to trust the Iranians, give me a break. Today we have a similar. It's a treaty. It's not an agreement like this is. Treaties have to be confirmed by the Senate. Agreements don't. But the president felt the pressure and agreed that Congress is going to vote on this, although it's a strange way that it will get approved or disapproved. But we've got this treaty with the Russians on nuclear arms. We have Russians living in the United States today. We have Americans living inside of Russia today. If a Russian member of that team comes to Kings Bay tomorrow and knocks on the door and says, I want to examine your nuclear arsenal, they come in and we give them full and free access. We do the same thing in Russia. We don't have issues with it because it's a part of the deal. The deal here, I understand, is that we notify the Iranians we want to go to the Iraq facility and we want to examine it, and they have 14 days to let us in there. Now, I haven't seen that. That's why I want to see what's in there. If that's in there, then this deal is meaningless. But here's what I have a fundamental problem with relative to this particular agreement. I've traveled the world over 20 years, most of which has been into the military theaters that we were engaged in, primarily Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen what's happened to our young men and women firsthand. Here we are negotiating with a group in Tehran or from Tehran who have been primarily responsible for the manufacturing of IEDs and the development of the construction of those weapon systems that have killed and maimed our kids. And we're in discussions with them and think that we're going to trust these guys to do what they say they're going to do when they continue to manufacture those weapons now. They're going into Syria, they're going into Iraq, they're going into Afghanistan right on, and our men and women in uniform are subject to attack by weapon systems that were designed and in some instances coming out of Iran. Secondly, you have a leadership in Tehran that as late as over the weekend stood up in public and said death to America. I mean, we're negotiating with people who are publicly saying that America is the worst thing that ever happened to the world. Now, that being said, I want to make sure they don't have the capability of developing a nuclear weapon, and we need to do whatever we can do to stop that. But very honestly, there is a reason that folks in Tehran are celebrating in the streets today like they have been since this announcement was made. And the reason is they are finally going to be freed from these awful sanctions that they have been under. And let me tell you, they were working. They were really feeling the pinch. Some people say you can't negotiate through sanctions. And a lot of times that's true. But let me tell you, these sanctions were working, and what we should have done instead of loosening them is tighten them. And if we had tightened them, then we had other means by which, if they didn't come to the table under our terms and our conditions, that we could have eliminated their capability to build a nuclear weapon. So I'm not a fan of the negotiation. Whether or not I come out in support or in opposition to the document itself, I just want to see it before I do. It looks like there's some Democrats who have real questions about it.
Yeah. Senator, regarding your comments about sequestration, the news that came out this week about Georgia continuing to lose military jobs in several of our locations, is that a function of sequestration or reallocation of assets? And second question about Bragg, how vulnerable is Dobbins?
The downsizing of the Army is a direct result of sequestration. We are at a level today that is pre-World War II from the standpoint of the force structure within the Army. It's going to continue to come down because the Army is a lot bigger than either the Air Force or the Navy. So it's going to be disproportionate, but it's proportionate within the force structure that exists. We've been blessed, but we've also had some pretty good work that's been done in years past, going all the way back to Richard Russell and coming through Sam Nunn and some other work that we've been blessed to participate in over the last 12 years, so that our bases are really strong. 1 out of every 2 soldiers that raises their hand and becomes a new member of the United States Army goes to Fort Benning. We have the Armor School at Fort Benning. If any of you have been by, if you've driven Corridor Z, you've seen the huge construction projects that have been ongoing over there. They're massive. And that's a result of what came out of the last round of BRAC. And we were we lost 3 bases. We really didn't lose. We lost one, in my opinion, that is a total disaster. Fort McPherson should never have closed. But the Navy school, it was only a matter of time, and Fort Gillem was only a matter of time. But even though we did see those three bases closed, we were the largest, we had the largest increase of military personnel of any state in the Union after the last round of BRAC. We increased by over 10,000, primarily because of the movement of the Army school, the armor school. But we have one of the largest populations of military personnel, particularly on the Army side, with Fort Stewart and Fort Benning. And it was, we knew we were going to lose a battalion at Fort Stewart. And this just ratified that. This sequestration move ratified that. That's not the worst thing in the world that could happen to us, but since we knew it was coming. But what we're seeing at Fort Benning is not good. It's an indication that sequestration is going to take us even further down, and this supposedly gets us down to 440,000 members of the Army. The next move is probably going to take us to 408. If we get to 408, then we're going to have a very, very hollow Army. And that's when it will really hurt. So I'm hopeful that Congress is going to take some action on sequestration. There's a move right now. The president said he's going to veto the defense authorization bill because it has a plus-up of $38 billion for defense. He'll never do that. If he vetoes that, then we'll have 100 Republicans in the Senate next year. I just don't think there's any way the president does that. As far as the next round of BRAC, I have said over my dead body after the last round of BRAC, would we ever have another round while I was in the Senate? I meant that in a very serious way because that round of BRAC was very politicized. As I say, Fort McPherson should not have closed. Number one, we didn't have a significant number of personnel out there compared to other bases, but we had what we call FORSCOM there, which is the brains of the United States Army. It was located at Fort McPherson. And there are lots of brass, lots of brass. And what these men and women did was basically travel from theater to theater and from command to command, helping make decisions on the operation within theater as well as within the Army itself. So it meant that they stay on airplanes all the time, and they were 15 minutes from Hartsfield, where they could catch a plane and go anywhere in the world. Well, they moved most of FORSCOM. They kind of split it up, but moved most of it to Fort Bragg. And I run into these guys that I know in FORSCOM in the Atlanta airport now, and what they do is they catch a plane in North Carolina, fly to Atlanta, and then fly out of Atlanta. That's stupid. It just made no sense whatsoever. So I have just, and there were some other situations that occurred in the last round of BRAC that never should have occurred. That being said, if we go down to 408, we're already down to about 276 ships in the Navy. We haven't been under 300 ships in years and years and years. In the Air Force, we're now finally building, at least in the preliminary stages. I think an announcement will be made in probably September, October about a new bomber, but we hadn't made a bomber in, gosh, 10 years, 12 years. We discontinued the F-22, so the number of tactical aircraft we've got has been dwindling. I say that just to say that we've got excess capacity in virtually every base, and that's what generates conversation about BRAC. And people within the, particularly within each administration, it's not unique to this administration, always make the argument that we've got to reduce defense spending, and one way we can do that is to reduce excess capacity. We need to close a bunch of bases. I've never, ever, in any instance, seen a base that has been closed where we save money. It just does not happen. And their argument is a very shallow argument on why we need to close bases. particularly with us downsizing for the wrong reason, downsizing because of sequestration. We need to be spending some extra money on defense, and it needs to come out of some other programs versus having to go through the battle with the White House that we're going through now with respect to the budget. Dobbins is one of those bases that's got some vulnerability. Clearly. The missions we've got there have been reserve missions. We have moved the Georgia National Guard to Dobbins. That was a smart move, a good move. Lockheed needs an active base there because Lockheed is going to continue to manufacture 130s, and we do a part of the F-35 there, so we need that runway, and we need somebody to help them pay the expenses of that runway, but that's not going to be enough to save the base. We need missions there, and we're seeing missions move out rather than move in right now. So it's vulnerable, but we'll deal with it now from the standpoint of continuing trying to put missions in there. And if we do have another round of BRAC that's scheduled, our case is being made for all of our bases now, but Dobbins particularly. Yes, sir.
On a lighter note, what's your opinion of the situation with Donald Trump?
Well, I would say selling his TV show, but since they're taking him off the air right and left, I don't know. I know Donald well. He's a good guy. He's one of those individuals that doesn't make any difference where he is or what the issue is. He's going to say what he thinks right off the top of his head. I do think that his statements on immigration were very calculated. He wanted to separate himself from the other 250 folks that are in that primary. And he could grab the headlines, and he did. He has. He's been in the headlines for the last, 3 weeks now. And there was a poll out yesterday where all of a sudden he's number one. Well, he's ahead in the polls just because people know his name. They don't know who George Pataki is or Jim Gilmore and even John Kasich. But they know Donald Trump. They know his name. So his method is working. But frankly, I think his statements were a little strong and don't help the party. I don't care whether he was right in the statements. I've been very strong proponent of border security and saying that it doesn't make any difference what kind of immigration, comprehensive immigration bill we passed. If you don't secure the border, it means nothing. I mean, Reagan did this, 30 years ago. And here we are back in the same situation again, so you've got to seal the border. But the inflammatory statements, I don't think help the process. It's not going to get anything done. What it does is it just divides people. It creates division within our party, number one, but it creates division within the country. And on an issue as critical as immigration reform, we need everybody in the same wagon together and trying to figure out a solution to it. But you got to give the guy credit. He's on every TV show now. Every news cycle has got Donald Trump saying whatever. He makes nice ties, too.
Senator, welcome back, and it's always good to see a Moultrie boy come full circle. You may not remember, your office helped me with the National Security Education Program, and I believe you were in a trailer when I first came to D.C., and started off.
Made in Georgia, though.
That's right.
By golly, it was a nice trailer that we were in.
And certainly appreciate all that, and also the challenge of some of these security breaches that I'm personally dealing with. I got back and thought it was over with, and there you go. It's back in that same boat. I'm curious, though, out of all this challenge and heartache, what is it that you think about a part of the world, a country, an initiative or an issue, something that's working right? You know, George Bush recently talked about PEPFAR, the AIDS relief work that he and Laura are still involved in. What gives you hope for your grandchildren, for my kids?
Well, the
at this
program
point?
you mentioned is one that does. I went to Africa. Let's see, August will be, next month be 2 years ago. And we, Lindsey Graham and Richard Burr and John Thune and I were over there. And we met, first of all, with Melinda Gates. We were in Ethiopia, Rwanda, the Congo, and Liberia, right in the heart of sub-Saharan Africa. Some of the poorest part of the world that exists. But we met with Melinda Gates in Ethiopia, and she and Bill have a program going over there in concert with the U.S. government under PEPFAR, where they've been working on the eradication of polio and AIDS, and it's working. It is absolutely working. And the way they're doing it is kind of spectacular. I mean, they have these 17, 18-year-old women who they've been trained as, they call them nurses. They're not near an LPN even, but they have enough training to be able to make sure that people get medication, take their medication. They will travel miles and miles and miles across very rugged terrain to deliver that medication to a remote part of in their case, Ethiopia. And they have these clinics set up all over where the women, pregnant women, come, and they also have the males that come, and they're taking their medication, and it's working. It's eradicating AIDS in that part of the world. We are this close to the eradication of polio in that part of the world. We also, going to the Congo was quite an experience. They agreed, they knew we were coming, and Cindy McCain was with us, and Cindy has a hospital in, on the border of the Congo and Rwanda. And we were going to her hospital, and while we were there, we were going to meet with some of the local politicians who have some issues with some things that we're doing over there. And the rebels agreed to stop firing rockets at the NATO facility, the UN facility where we were going to meet them while we were there. They said, we'll give you 2 hours. And so they quit shelling it, and then when we left, they started shelling it again. But when we were in Liberia, we were with Bono. And Bono is doing the same thing in Liberia that Bill and Melinda are doing in Ethiopia. And it's working. He goes beyond that. He's doing some agricultural work over there too. And you talk about a country or a region that is ready to explode if they have modern technology. They don't even have tractors over there. You'll see one every now and then, but most everything is done by hand, and they're not planting GMO seeds, which is a huge mistake. But the reason they don't plant GMO seeds is because 100% of their production is either used internally or it goes to the European Union. The European Union won't allow any import of products that are produced from genetically modified seeds. And Bono is participating in the polio eradication and the AIDS eradication also. It's not as prevalent in that part of Africa, but it's amazing work that's being done over there. And again, it's with PEPFAR funds. So when I got back from that trip, first thing I did was call up 43 and I said, Mr. President, I don't know what you think your legacy is going to be, but I can tell you what it is. The work that we are doing with PEPFAR, which was very controversial when we passed it, but the work we're doing is amazing. And America's actually getting some credit for it in that part of the world. And I'll close with a quick anecdote on what we saw in Liberia. Liberia has been through civil unrest, just like most of those countries over there. And they went through a very bad civil war in which all of their power plants were blown up. All of their water production plants were blown up. About 10% of Liberia has electricity today. We toured one of the plants, that is under reconstruction. There is a young man who is from Liberia, who came to the United States to get educated and who now has gone back to Liberia. We saw this over and over. He's gone back to Liberia now, and he is responsible for the implementation of this program to rebuild the power plants to produce electricity to serve the country of Liberia. Guess where that young man was educated? University of Georgia. Pretty neat. It was a pretty emotional couple of days he and I had over there, because it is so poor and so backwards. And to think that there's a guy that has a connection with UGA there who is leading the fight, it's pretty good. It's pretty neat stuff. Well, anyway, y'all got to go to work, and I got to go to work. Judy here, she's my boss, so she's going to run me out here. Thank y'all for letting me come share some thoughts with you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We also are tremendously proud that you are a UGA and Terry College alum, and thank you for your service as well.
I appreciate that, Dean. Thank you.
And that's a sculpture by Loretta Eby, red and black, bulldog
All right,
color.
there you go.